Picaresque and Pornography in the Old Curiosity Shop by Grace Lavery. Liberal defenses of porn, it has become something of a cliche to remark, tend to rely more on the theory than the practice, or rather, defenses of porn tend to treat porn as a genre, whose premises are therefore contested, whereas the critique treats porn as either a tone, once introduced, everything ruined, or an industry. The defense does not require the exoneration of all porn, only some. The critique, meanwhile, can claim that some limited exemptions, queer porn, where queer is used as a synonym for ethical, perhaps gay porn in which no women were harmed, aren't really porn. Leo Bersani's remarks in Is the Rectum a Grave? Appear to resolve this impasse by ensuring that the anti-loving nature of porn reflects the fundamentally anti-loving character of sex. Yet here too the assimilation of that negativity into the queer mirrored, albeit perhaps undeliberately, the defense of porn with its difference from heterosexual hardcore. And perhaps not undeliberately, Linda Williams' revisiting of hardcore exhibits remorse that porn studies seemed to enable and even encourage the worst excesses of the porn industry. More recently, Eugenie Brinkema and Kathleen Luby have examined the formal and political disruptiveness of straight hardcore, especially as it both instantiates and fails to depict idealized heterosexual relations. Like Bersani, although more subtly, Brinkema and Luby both accept the anti-porn designation of porn as a kind of tone, a moment of palpable meaning which deforms the prevailing condition of its medium, and which therefore troubles the differences between medium and message. Though neither engages in what one might call an ethical defense of straight hardcore, they both treat the most difficult to defend aspect of pornography as the one upon which its political effects must finally be assessed. These theoretical developments, as Luby shows, can enable readers to discover pornographic methods in texts at some remove from the genre. For example, Charles Dickens' earliest novel, The Old Curiosity Shop, depends, rather surprisingly it must be admitted, upon a reader's capacity to read pornographically. Since the primary object of its fetishistic attention is a girl child, and the predatory figures that surround her are all much older men, the ethical stakes could hardly be higher. Some of the novel's readers have examined this dimension of The Old Curiosity Shop before. In Catherine Robson's treatment of Little Nell in Men in Wonderland, The Lost Girlhood of the Victorian Gentleman, we encounter Dickens holding his heroine's sexual suggestiveness gently and ambivalently, as when the novel is deleted from an early draft, a moment when a character asks Nell what she has been doing, and she responds, selling diamonds, a reply that Robson characterizes as unsettling and potentially equivocal. Robson further observes that Nell's subordination to the schemes of Quilp are less compulsive, because more archly feigned, than her manipulation by the novel's kindly old men, especially her own grandfather. Yet following Brinkema's insistence on the roughness of porn, I here suggest that the psychological isolation of Nell in Robson's reading restricts the libidinal economy of a novel whose internal coherence has been detonated, such that the differences between characters can hardly be taken for granted. The first effect of that detonation is the cartoonish and ultimately pornographic rendering of every character as a kind of cipher. The Old Curiosity Shop presents a world where everything has been ineluctably, totally, as if in a fairy tale, miniaturized. Everything in the novel is small. The central character has become, in the retelling, Little Nell. Her grandfather's emaciation is described over and again. The villain, Daniel Quelp, is a dwarf. The love interest in the awkwardly tacked-on romance plot is seemingly anorexic. Not just the main characters, Dickens parades past his readers' eyes a sequence of small-end people, a school full of children who look like squat adults, a traveling troupe of waxworks of historical personages, a Punch and Judy show, the hero of which, with his cartoonish tendency towards violence and utterly unrestrained pursuit of his own ends, reminds us of Quilp. The novel fully refuses to tell us the difference between a cartoonish violence that is supposed to be taken seriously and one which can be enjoyed as entertainment. In an unusual and in many ways uncharacteristic essay on Dickens, the Marxist critic Theodor Adorno dwells on the novel's entertainments in much the same way, offering a fascinating explanation for their appearances in The Old Curiosity Shop. Adorno writes, "I would like to talk about a book whose title is generally familiar, a book that may still be widely read, especially by children. But in the 90 years since Dickens' The Old Curiosity Shop appeared, inserted into another novel, some of the secrets embedded in the work, perhaps without the author knowing clearly that he was doing so, have become discernible. Dickens is currently considered to be one of the founders of the realistic and social novel. Historically, this is correct, but when one examines the form of his work itself, it requires some qualification. For Dickens' fictional work, in which poverty, despair, and death have already been recognized as the fruits of a bourgeois world, a world to which only the traces of human warmth and kindness and individual human relationships can reconcile one, this work also contains the outlines of a completely different sort of view of the world. You may call it pre-bourgeois. In it, the individual has not yet reached full autonomy, nor, therefore, complete isolation, but instead is presented as a bearer of objective factors, of a dark, obscure fate, and a star-like consolation that overtake the individual and permeate his life, but never follow from the law of the individual, as do, for instance, the fates of the characters in Flaubert's novels. The novels of Dickens contain a fragment of the dispersed Baroque that maintains a strange ghostly presence in the 19th century and the 1800s. You know it from the plays of Raymond and even Nestroy, but it is also contained, in more hidden form, in the apparently so individualistic philosophy of Kierkegaard. We can forgive Adorno his rather shallow reading of Flaubert, whose Bovary is partly represented here, but at the expense of any credible account of Beauvais et Pouchet or even Salammbô, because the reading of Dickens is so astute. The essence of the Dickensian is a particular kind of remnant of capital's own prehistory, which appears not as romanticism or nostalgia, where it would remain pastoral, as such remnants do for a George Eliot or Anthony Trollope, but as the paradoxically definitive quality of the collective, the urban, the modern. The Dickensian Baroque is to capital what the Leotardian postmodern is to modernism, an effect whose emergence, bizarrely, conditioned the very structure it was supposed to supersede. The postmodern can be found nowhere more fully realized than in the Wildian fin de siècle, says Lyotard, but the Baroque can be found nowhere more fully realized than in the Dickensian novel of modernity, says Adorno. By way of exploring what Adorno might have meant by the dispersed Baroque in this context, we might consider one of the novel's many dream sequences, in this case a dream of Nell's after a narrow escape from her pursuer, Quilp, amid the waxworks at Mrs. Jarley's traveling show. Notwithstanding these protections, she could get none but broken sleep by fits and starts all night, for fear of Quilp, who throughout her uneasy dreams was somehow connected with the waxwork, or was waxwork himself, or was Mrs. Jarley and waxwork too, or was himself, Mrs. Jarley, waxwork, and a barrel organ all in one, and yet not exactly any of them either. At length, towards break of day, that deep sleep came upon her which succeeds to weariness and overwatching, and which has no consciousness but one of overpowering and irresistible enjoyment. Clearly, the passage comports with many of the elements of Freudian dream work as he teaches it in 1900. Condensation, the Quilp element is saturated by other elements, displacement, the appearance of the barrel organ, and secondary revision, in the sense that Nell's dream creates the conditions of possibility for its own interpretation. The question of scene setting, that Freud finds so fascinating, hardly occurs in Nell's dream, though perhaps it is the lack of a setting that troubles the narrator, who seems aware that the uneasiness of the dream is part of its structure as well as its content. Yet as startling as may be this foreshadow of Freud, still more so is the realization that the hydraulics of dream possess, for Dickens, the properties of one of their elements, that is, the dream is waxy. It waxes, elements wax into each other in it, the dream is almost flesh, but flesh that can merge with other flesh, can become glossy and transmute without denaturing. Moreover, a certain waxiness gets glazed onto the bodies of all characters that come into contact with Jarley's exhibition of wax representations of historical figures. Nell walked down the canvas, and read aloud, in enormous black letters, the inscription, "Jarley's Waxwork." "Read it again," said the lady complacently. "Jarley's Waxwork," repeated Nell. "That's me," said the lady. "I am Mrs. Jarley." Mrs. Jarley later justifies her craft by insisting, "It is not funny at all," and that, "I won't go so far as to say that, as it is, I've seen waxwork quite like life, but I've certainly seen some life that was exactly like waxwork." The dispersed Baroque as the revenge of material against structure, of wax against personhood, against dream, and against language. Such waxiness drips or merges with language itself, which is no surprise, since Dickens also preempts Lacan in his implication that the structure of Nell's dream is formed as a syntax. The Dickensian dream syntax, however, is prosaic rather than merely semantic. The Jarley Waxwork exhibition advertises itself by deformation and reformation in the form of parodies on popular melodies, of which Dickens gives us only one. "If I had a donkey, what wouldn't go to see Mrs. Jarley's waxwork show? Do you think I'd acknowledge him? Oh, no, no. They run to Jarley's." We are left to imagine the rhyme's closure, which might repeat the second line, but might just as well be tomorrow or bungalow or such. One modern version of the nursery rhyme suggests that perhaps another couplet is missing from Jarley's version. "If I had a donkey that wouldn't go, do you think I'd beat him? Oh, no, no. I'd put him in a barn and give him some corn, the best little donkey that ever was born." Whereas an American ballad from the same period, published 1840, same year as The Old Curiosity Shop, offers a more complex prosodic arrangement. "If I had a donkey, what wouldn't go? Do you think I'd wallop him? No, no, no. By gentle means I'd try, d'ye see, because I hate all cruelty. If all had been like me, in fact, there'd have been no occasion for Martin's Act, dumb animals to prevent getting cracked on the head. For if I had a donkey, what wouldn't go? I never would wallop him, no, no, no. I'd give him some hay and cry, Geo, and come up, Nettie." The implication here is that beating a donkey teaches the donkey to kick in response, as happens to the villain of the older version, that cruel chap, Bill Bohr. I'm not trying to restore Jarley's jingle into an original version, but rather to observe the curious blend of moralism, violence, and simplicity that can be made to run into each other by this cheerful mechanical rhyme, which like Nell's dream fails or refuses to make clear what object is what, leaving only the central image, a donkey is being beaten, somewhere out of the range of reference. The dispersed Baroque, then, entails a special relationship to violence, since violence cannot be dispersed, and is indeed a mode by which form and matter interact. It poses a particular challenge to Dickens, for whom Punch and Judy-like violence is everywhere. Force, terror, impact, these are elements of the jingle and the dream likewise, never absentable, and yet never fully representable either. In the dispersed Baroque, violence is method. There is another element of The Old Curiosity Shop that demands this kind of attention, and yet Adorno is too polite to mention it: the close affinity between Dickensian waxiness and the Victorian pornography itself. Narrative pornography had already developed a stock of characters, tropes, and devices by 1840. Indeed, it had done so primarily through the picaresque, which receded in Dickens' fiction, and in that of his imitators, but remained from then to the present the dominant mode of pornographic writing, and now of pornographic video. Yet a question may be asked about whether pornography produces characters, and if so, upon what theory such characterizations depend. One provisional answer nestles in a subordinate clause close to the beginning of Stephen Marcus's foundational study of mid-Victorian pornography, The Other Victorians, when it is observed in passing that, in pornography no person, object, or idea is incapable of being enlisted in the cause of sexual activity. Character, then, exists only provisionally as a pretext for a more generically primal enlistment, a seduction, a being sucked into the whirlpool of sex that pornography sets out, if not to depict, then at least to present. Marcus's point is affirmed at each moment in which porn promises to educate its characters. The moment, for example, when the straight boy removes his blindfold to reveal that it is a man sucking his cock and that he rather likes it. when Justine learns that she can enjoy even the chastisement she receives for her good conduct. Character exists as a mere precondition for an erasure that occurs, both chronologically and formally, at the moment of sexual pleasure. The theory of character would then be something like, there are no characters at the moment of orgasm, and it is the task of pornography to persuade its consumers of this fact. We are all the same underneath our characters, though probably Sade and BaitBus.com would entail different conceptualizations of what's underneath. Pornography turns characteristic particularity into sex, which it must therefore posit as a non-particularizable field. But character is, as Marcus says, hardly unique in being subjected to such treatment in porn. Everything is. On the one side, social organization, medium specificity, the naive mode of self-differentiation we call character. On the other, the shattered sexual subject, an affective intensity whose specifications have been negated, a momentary convergence of fictional and realist epistemologies. Is it possible to talk about pornography without characterizing sex in such absolute terms? Perhaps Brinkma's work on rough sex might prompt us to question Marcus's notion of enlistment in one particular. What if the sex to which no person, object, or idea is incapable of being enlisted lacked the conceptual or institutional unity necessary for such a task? It is not merely, Brinkma might say, that legal and historical authorities cannot agree what pornography is, but that pornography fundamentally disturbs its consumer's sense of what sex is. Not merely in the morally panicked sense of producing unrealistic expectations. The roughness, of which Brinkma makes extensive use in her essay, associates the violent aesthetics of rough porn with the provisional and chaotic assembly of pornography as a genre, suggesting that, just as the assembly of the archive of pornography is necessarily incomplete, so the constitution of sexual pleasure, that to which Marcus entrusts the responsibility to obliterate character, is founded only haphazardly and contingently. And so it is. Although each number of The Pearl contained a few distinct short stories and body poems, each also contained serialized stories in which continuity of character, though not of setting, was reinstantiated. In one such, Sub Umbra, or Sport Among the She-Noodles, the characters' various sexual encounters hardly climax at all, at least in the narrative sense of the word. Each experience of sexual pleasure is itself folded back into the loose narrative framework. Walter, the narrator, and his cousin Annie have sex in the first installment, yet they return to do so again and again in the remaining 7. The relationship between each encounter and its precedents is not precisely accretive. They do not refer to any previous encounters, nor do they seem to learn anything about each other. But, given the continuities and discontinuities of the serial narrative form, we can be sure that these characters have not been simply dissolved in sex either. Though in this particular case the endurance of character is underwritten by the medium of serialized fiction, a similar effect is ensured by video pornography's own star system. Though a particular scene may end predictably, the porn star will return, as actor and as character. The serial aspect of pornography therefore appears not merely a vestigial remnant of Victorian print culture, but a condition of possibility for pornographic consumption as such, eludes enlistment into Marcus's quantum singularity of sexual activity. That seriality necessitates some principle of characterology seems important too, insofar as the possibility of sexual particularity remains roundly denied by discussants of pornography on all sides of the question, by anti-porn crusaders, for whom pornography is a perversion of proper sexuality or of the ethical treatment of human beings, but also by pro-porn critics, for whom the infinite diversity of pornographic fantasy merely reproduces, at a different order, the singularity of fantasy itself. Brinkma's intervention enables a reformulation of the initial question, then, in the following terms: who can survive sex? In pornography, though, no person, object, or idea is incapable of being enlisted into sexual activity, and one might add, no text either. No text, and certainly not a novel organized around the delicious spectatorship of early adolescent female vulnerability, can immunize itself against pornographic use. Nell's little death in number 44, January 30, 1841, occasioned an international outpouring of grief that shattered the border between real-world and phantasmatic epistemologies as decisively as any money shot. That historical event of public tenderness has itself been subject to innumerable cruel recontextualizations. Oscar Wilde may or may not have delivered the words attributed to him by Ada Leverson, that one must have a heart of stone to read the death of little Nell without laughing, but they have been attributed to him since. Aldous Huxley certainly did characterize Nell's death as the central example of Dickens' monstrous emotional vulgarity, adding, "There was something rather wrong with a man who could take this lachrymose and tremulous pleasure in adult infantility." The tear-jerking pleasure Huxley assigns to Dickens is patently a symptom of his moral and emotional corruption, contemplation of which stirs in Huxley images of unpleasant liquid emissions. The overflowing of his heart drowns his head. His one and only desire on these occasions is just to overflow, a stanchless flux, mentally drowned and blinded by the sticky overflowings of his heart. Whenever he is in his melting mood, Dickens ceases to be able, and probably ceases even to wish, to see reality. For Huxley at least, The Old Curiosity Shop provokes such psychic association between sentimental crying and compulsive masturbation. He had an overflowing heart, but the trouble was that it overflowed with such curious and even rather repellent secretions.